Hello everyone, Mr. Ristau here. Ready to give you the lecture notes for Chapter 2. Right, we've wrapped up Chapter 1 last week, took our our formative test. And as promised, here are the lecture notes for Chapter 2. So hopefully you're ready to rock and roll. And we're going to be talking about now beginning Period 2. You can see Period 2 in your College Board outline covers the year 1607 to 1754, okay? And this is a period of time where Europeans are beginning to come to the North American continent, ready to build and establish permanent colonies in America. This is where we begin to see eventually the 13 original colonies. So we're starting to make a slowly but sure way up to the American Revolution. Okay, the slides that I'm using are the second half of the notes that we used for Chapter 1. So they're the same slide deck, and I'm just working my way through. I'm about halfway through here. All right. So hopefully this is coming across to you well. The video is clear, and hopefully you can hear me okay. So we're going to go through Chapter 2, and I think the advantage of having the lecture notes like this, rather than maybe sitting in class online or in the Google Meet, is that, of course, you can watch these at your leisure. You can go back and watch what you need to watch, maybe use them as a review and whatnot. Okay. So Chapter 2 begins approximately in the year 1521, and it covers all the way up to 1700. Even though Period 2 is really kind of what my focus is. You want to think of APUSH maybe in periods, all right? So we're really dealing with 1607 to 1754. This just happens, Chapter 2 happens to start a little before that. Okay, so if we can get going here. We had talked about the effects of the Spanish Empire and the inroads that they had made during the late 15th century, but certainly the 16th century, the 1500s. Well, by 1588, there were more world players, we'll say, on the scene, namely the British, the English. And the Spanish suffered a key loss. The Spanish Armada did. The Spanish Armada was essentially the Spanish naval fleet, and that took place in 1588. And the reason this was significant is that it established the British as an up-and-coming world naval power. And that would have an impact on what the British intended to do in North America, right? The Spanish and Portuguese kind of laid the groundwork for colonization in North America and South America, and that inspired the French and the Dutch and the English to do the same. The Spanish Armada defeat was a key naval victory for the British because it allowed them to pursue their interests in colonizing North America eventually. And England, we know, was a largely Protestant country, right? Unlike Spain, which is largely Catholic. And the way they went about colonizing North America is that they set up basically 3 different types of colonies, and you want to know these, okay? You want to know how they were paid for and how they were run, because they were different depending on which colony we're talking about. So one type, the first type, was known as a joint stock company. A joint stock company is pretty much what it sounds like. Stockholders in England, for example, would pool their money together and they would invest in a company. And then they would share then in the potential profits. They would issue a charter, and then they would share in any profits that the colony eventually would enjoy, or the losses. There was also a risk. So think of it as kind of an investor today, right? You take your money and you invest in a company. Well, when you do that, you are taking a gamble. If the company does well, you're going to share in the profits of the company. If the company does poorly, you're going to be risking losing your money. And if the company does poorly, you're going to lose your money. That's essentially what a joint stock company was. You were investing in the success of a colony. It was also known as a corporate colony. Okay, and it was basically run much like a corporation. People would settle here in North America. We'll talk about later on where these colonies were. And you might see it in your book written as a corporate colony. right? And the investors would either enjoy the success of the colony or the losses of the colony. The second type of colony was a proprietorship. This is when the monarchy, in this case the King of England, would issue a charter or land that would block out X amount of land over here in North America, and they would give it to a specific individual or a group of people. In other words, they would be the proprietor of that colony, of that land, and they would run the colony when they got over here to North America. The third type of colony was the royal colony, and a royal colony was directly paid for by the English treasury, the monarchy, and the monarchy directly ruled the colony from Great Britain. Right? So each had their own little ways of being paid for, right? And how they were run. Now, eventually, almost all of the colonies became royal colonies in the end over the next 100 years, but they did not all start out that way. Okay, the first colony that was actually that was attempted to be established in 1587, you can see here on the map down here in the lower left, was the colony of Roanoke. Walter Raleigh landed there, and in 1587, and it was a disaster. It's also known as the Lost Colony because no one actually really knows what happened to the people once they landed here. Historians believe that the colony lasted for anywhere between a month or 2 or 3 months, and because of the weather, the lack of food and whatnot in the environment, many of the colonists died or ran into American Indian tribes and things like that. So no one really knows what happened to the lost colony of Roanoke. But technically, that was the first attempt at English colonization here in North America. Okay, so the first area that we're going to start with is known as the area known as the Chesapeake colonies. And the Chesapeake colonies primarily are made up of present-day Virginia and present-day Maryland. Okay, the first permanent English colony in North America, of course, was Jamestown, and that was established in 1607. And the reason the English settled at Jamestown, the motivation was completely based on wealth, revenue. In other words, it was a colony that was designed, it was a corporate colony, it was a joint stock company, and it was designed to earn profits, to earn revenue. And those parts of those revenue, parts of those profits would be paid back to the investors. This was not a proprietorship. It was not a tract of land given to one person for him to run. And it was not a royal colony, not yet. In other words, it wasn't paid for and run directly by the monarchy. So you can see here it was set up as a joint stock company. It was known as the Virginia Company. The Virginia Company was the company that set up the colony, and investors pooled their money together to invest in Jamestown. And once they arrived, they really had a difficult time of it. The first year or two, many people died of starvation. It was known as the starving period. The winters were very harsh. Many of the original settlers died of disease of some kind, and like I said, starvation. And many, of course, ran into conflict with American Indian tribes in the region. The leader or the head of the colony, you probably have heard of him, was Captain John Smith. Eventually, to save the colony, he established what would be kind of the equivalent of a military dictatorship, if you will. But he established military discipline over the people to actually save the colony. Because in these people, you have to imagine, none of them knew really what they were doing, right? They were new to the area, completely different environment. They didn't know how to survive here. So he established some sort of military discipline over the colony, and eventually, after the first couple of years, they did make it through. By the second, third, and fourth year, they introduced a new kind of product known as tobacco, that they realized that tobacco could be grown very successfully in this part of the country, especially in present-day Virginia. And Jamestown and other colonies like Virginia and Maryland would become huge tobacco producers much throughout the South, at least during the 17th century. So tobacco became what was known as a cash crop. When you see the term cash crop, it's a term that's used to describe what is the primary crop, what was the primary source of revenue. And remember, during this time, everything is agricultural based, right? There's no manufacturing really of any kind. It's not industry, it's all agriculture. So tobacco was the cash crop in the Chesapeake colonies largely. And eventually what this would do is it would lead to what was known as the plantation system. And we see this system come about really once cotton starts to become the cash crop and the introduction of African-American slaves in the southern colonies. But over time, over the 17th century, the plantation system starts to take shape. And what that means is many of these colonies, especially the Chesapeake colonies, there was a high demand for labor and cheap labor. So what many of these farmers, especially wealthy elite farmers, started to do is they started to offer payments for people back in England. They would pay for their way over here, and then that person would promise to work anywhere from 4 to 7 years on the plantation. They would become known as an indentured servant. So these indentured servants had their passage paid for over the Atlantic over here to North America, and the trade-off was they would then work on a plantation for a wealthy farmer or whatnot, plantation owner, anywhere from 4 to 7 years, depending on what the contract said. Okay, and that was the give and take, and this was largely the source of the cheap labor supply throughout much of the 17th century up until the late 1600s, and then slowly that would dissipate and slavery would take its place. Along with the indentured servitude was a system known as the headright system that the middle colonies, or I should say the Chesapeake colonies, employed. And the headright system was simply based on the idea that if you paid for someone's journey over here, so if I'm the wealthy farmer, right, and I paid for someone's trip over here to become my indentured servant, then I would get the land that I am farming right now. Okay, so I'm paying for someone to come over here to help me farm it. They're my indentured servant, and then I would also receive that land and the possibility of even more land. Now, the problem with the headright system is that it heavily favored the wealthy elite farmer, right? Because only the wealthy elite farmer could afford to pay for indentured servants. So, in other words, the more indentured servants you help pay their trip for coming over the Atlantic, the more land you would receive. So there eventually would become a huge imbalance, right, between the very wealthy elite farmer, plantation owner, and the have-nots. A big difference between the have and the have-nots in the Chesapeake colonies. One of the things that many of the colonies had in common, and we haven't talked about the other regions yet, is this idea of representative government. When the people did land here, they quickly established a form of government whereby they would elect and choose representatives on their behalf to make political decisions for them. One of the earliest forms, if not the earliest form of representative government, was the Virginia House of Burgesses. And that was established in 1619, which coincidentally is also the same year that the first boat of African-American slaves arrived at Jamestown. So that's how you can remember the two. We got the first form of representative government. We also had the first boat of African-American slaves that arrived in Jamestown. Both happened in Virginia, right? This was the first of its kind in what would become the future United States. And over time, throughout the 1630s, 40s, 50s, and well on into the century, what started to develop were 2 or 3 major issues that the people had to deal with. They found out that tobacco, even though it was a huge cash crop and moneymaker, it tended to wear out the fertility of the soil and it started to destroy the land. So they had to figure out ways in which to continue to plant tobacco or come up with some sort of crop that would replace tobacco. Not entirely, but at least replace it that could be grown without destroying the land. So that was one major issue. Second major issue is that as the demand for cheap labor continued to rise, right, as indentured servants started to come over, the price of land also started to go up. So not everybody could afford to be part of, for example, like I said earlier, the headright system, and not everyone could afford to pay for indentured servants to come over. And land became very expensive. So with the price of labor, also the price of land started to rise. All right, and that continued to widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And you'll see later on this is going to lead to class conflict within Virginia with Bacon's Rebellion. We'll talk about that in a minute here. And then the third is that, of course, we had continuing and ongoing tensions between the colonists and the Native American population. All right, colonists from this point forward continue on to move west. Now, west, of course, then did not mean the same as it is today. We're not talking about California. West, we're basically talking about where the Appalachian mountain chain is, right? That was the West back then. The point is, as colonists continued to want to move westward, they encountered more and more conflict and tension with American Indian tribes. So those are the three major problems that they had to deal with. Now, the other Chesapeake colony, remember we have Virginia, was Maryland, current-day Maryland. And Maryland was a proprietorship. It was a proprietor colony. The King of England granted a proprietorship, a charter, to Lord Baltimore. And Lord Baltimore was given the tract of land to settle, and you can see here on the map where approximately Maryland is. That's kind of the tract of land we're talking about, just north of Virginia, north of Jamestown. And this was a colony that was set up largely based on the idea of freedom of religion, with the idea that all different kinds of religious sects and whatnot, denominations would be tolerated. In fact, in 1649, the government there, the assembly passed the Act of Toleration, which in theory was supposed to give religious freedom for all Christians. Okay, and it was specifically intended to protect Catholics. Okay, if you remember anything about the colony of Maryland early on, this was supposed to be a safe haven for Catholics. Right? You might be thinking, well, that doesn't sound really a lot like religious toleration. Well, that was kind of the ironic thing about it. It was professed to be a colony open to, like I said, many religious denominations, but it was intended especially to protect Catholics. So if you were Jewish or if you were Muslim, they weren't protected necessarily under the law. All right. So that was the colony of Maryland, and we'll talk about Maryland a little bit more. But Lord Baltimore was the proprietor there. That was a proprietorship. So like I said earlier, many of the colonists started to eventually come into contact with, right, and would have future conflict and tension with American Indian groups. Generally speaking, if you recall back when we talked about the Spanish and the French and the Dutch, we said that those three global empires, largely when they arrived in North and Central and South America, especially North America, had a much more friendlier relationship with the indigenous population than the English did. Remember, we talked about how those other populations, those other countries intermarried, right, to a degree, or they, like the Spanish did, or they became allies with the American Indians, like the French and the Dutch did. But the English were different. They had a very hostile, acrimonious relationship with the American Indians. And the most notable tribe was the Powhatan tribe. And starting right away in 1610, this was even before, or just shortly after Jamestown was settled. You can see it was only about 3 years after Jamestown. Tensions started to increase as settlers started to move westward, right, infringing on American Indian land. And this would set off a 35 or 36-year war known as the Anglo-Powhatan Wars, Anglo referring to England. And it was a series of battles and wars that were off again, on again. The first war ended in 1614 when John Rolfe married Pocahontas. If you are familiar, of course, with the Disney movie Pocahontas, there are scenes in that movie that are from this time period. How accurate they are, there's a whole other story. But this was the time period when Rolfe marries Pocahontas. And by 1622, so it was about an 8-year break, there was a massacre that began the Second War, and you can kind of see a rendition, a painting of that massacre here on the slide. By 1624, because of all the conflict, Jamestown was struggling financially. Remember, it was a corporate colony. The King of England decides and says, "I've had enough. This is it. They're not doing well as a corporate colony, and I'm going to make it a royal colony." And remember, a royal colony was when the king, the monarchy, paid for and helped finance the colony directly, and the king now was basically in charge of the colony, right? By 1646, when the Powhatan Wars were over, the Powhatan Confederacy was largely defeated by the English settlers. It took them the better part of 35 years. And there was a couple of main reasons for that. One, of course, was disease, right? We talked about how when Europeans arrived here, they brought with them smallpox, and largely the indigenous population simply was not immune, of course, to smallpox. So many of them died simply because of disease and sickness. The Powhatan Confederacy was largely disorganized. They were not as organized as the English settlers were because they had the monarchy behind them. And they were disposable. They were easily disposed of in this larger 35-year war. Okay, so this would be an example. The Powhatan Wars is just simply an example of things to come, especially in the Northeast, when we talk about the relationship between the English and the American Indian tribes. I said earlier that as settlers started to bring in indentured servants and started to buy tracts of land, especially the elite, not everyone could afford to do that. And that would lead largely to class conflict. Okay, so during this early period, remember the labor source for a lot of the work that was done by indentured servants. The first Africans to arrive in Jamestown, in North America, was in 1619. And this would begin a slow transition from indentured servitude being the labor force supply to slaves. And the event that actually turned the tide towards slavery was Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. Okay, so what caused Bacon's Rebellion? You want to know what caused this and what the effects were. Well, the causes I have down here on the slide. There was a growing frustration with three things. Nathaniel Bacon, you see here on the slide, down here in the lower right. He was a farmer, and there was a growing frustration among Bacon and other farmers like him because of the lack of land. The governor of Virginia, Governor Berkeley, did not allow these farmers or the settlers to move too far to the west. You can see my arrows back here. We talked about colonists wanting to move west. Well, the governor in Virginia, Governor Berkeley, did not allow that to happen. And that was a problem with some of these farmers because they needed to spread out. They wanted more land. There was also a problem and frustration with the lack of political power. In other words, proportionally speaking, too much power in the House of Burgesses resided with the wealthy farmer elite, and not ordinary farmers, poor farmers like Nathaniel Bacon. So there was a power struggle, a power issue. And then the third cause is people like Bacon wanted the government in Jamestown to do something about the American Indian attacks. Colonists were constantly being attacked by American Indians in this part of the country. And they felt that Governor Berkeley, the government, was not doing anything to protect them. So when you combine these three things together, you get a man like Nathaniel Bacon who would lead a rebellion against the Indians, and eventually he would burn the colony of Jamestown to the ground to prove a point. And Bacon's rebellion was actually a rebellion based on class warfare, the frustrations that existed between the haves and the have-nots. What impact did this have? Well, the biggest impact, and you have to remember this, is that eventually it would lead to African-American chattel slave labor. This would introduce, really for the first time, a broad movement toward African-American slaves as being the chief source of labor, not indentured servitude anymore. Okay, and then a secondary effect, I guess, is that Bacon's Rebellion showed the tension that existed in the colonies, especially in the Chesapeake colonies, between the haves and the have-nots, the different social classes of the regions. In other words, the East Coast, wealthy frontier elite, versus what was known as the back country. Okay, the back country was known as, was that part of Virginia and Maryland that was further inland, not on the coast. That was considered, remember, the West back then. Okay, so Bacon's Rebellion is a significant event that took place in 1676. So those primarily are the middle colonies, or I shouldn't say middle. Those are the Chesapeake colonies, Virginia and Maryland. The other region, the second region, and we're going to be comparing these probably more so throughout the week and maybe even early next week when we get into Chapter 3, is the New England colonies. And the New England colonies were very different than the Chesapeake colonies. The New England colonies primarily were settled not for revenue or profit, but they were settled based on religion and freedom of religion, right? Because this is where now we start talking about the Pilgrims and the Puritans. So back then, this is what was known as New England. You can see here in my little inset map. Okay, so in other words, they had religious motives for colonizing, whereas the Chesapeake colonies, they had business or revenue motives for colonizing. So the first of the two major New England colonies was known as Plymouth Colony. Okay, the Protestant Reformation that took place in England when the church, Martin Luther, broke away from the Catholic Church, sparked all kinds of changes in Europe, and it led to this movement known as Puritanism. And Puritans were a group of people who simply wanted to purify the church. They didn't want to necessarily separate from the church. Okay, Pilgrims, on the other hand, were also known as separatists. Okay, separatists, or these Pilgrims, were a group of people who wanted to break away completely from the Anglican Church. Okay. Pilgrims wanted to establish land, a colony, eventually in North America, and they arrived here. You can see here in my map, in current-day Massachusetts. They're at Plymouth Colony, and they landed at Plymouth Rock, and they did so based on the idea that they wanted to separate completely from the Anglican Church of England. All right. So what they did on the way over here is they signed a piece of paper outlining their form of government. It was known as the Mayflower Compact, basically establishing the basic rule of government by majority rule. Remember that Virginia, the Chesapeake colonies have established in 1619, right, the Virginia House of Burgesses. This was kind of New England's answer to majority rule government, and it was based on the idea of self-government. It's arguably one of the first forms of direct democracy, where the people made the document themselves, right, and they make the decisions. So the leader of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Colony, you want to remember his name was William Bradford. So he was kind of the head of the Pilgrims. And when they arrived here, they were met by the leader Squanto, and he actually helped, and many of the American Indian groups here helped the Pilgrims make it through the early survival period, the early years here. Otherwise, many of them probably would have had the same outcome, or would have had the same experience as the Jamestown settlers did. So that was Plymouth Colony. That was roughly 1620, right? If you know your history or Schoolhouse Rock, that kind of stuff. You've seen videos and probably did some things in elementary school with the Pilgrims and Plymouth Rock. 10 years later, a new colony was founded, where in 1629, a guy named John Winthrop, you want to remember who John Winthrop is, was given a charter by the king to establish what was known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And you can kind of see that here on the map where Massachusetts Bay Colony is. It was directly north of Plymouth Colony. And if you remember anything about John Winthrop, he gave a speech on the way over here as well, known as the City Upon a Hill speech. And you want to remember that phrase because it's been used throughout American history and used as America as a beacon of light and hope for all countries and immigrants who have come here to be a city upon a hill. And he, in the context of 1629, of course, was referring to his colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Religion played a major role in the development of the New England colonies through education. This was the time period when Harvard University was founded, for example. Unlike Maryland, for example, whereas in theory all religions were tolerated, religious freedom here, though, was reserved only for Puritans. The Puritans were really hardcore religious people. Church membership was required to participate in politics. So basically the church and government decisions were intertwined, right? Church leaders made the government decisions, laws. It's known as a theocracy. We'll talk about that in a second. And in New England, the New England colonies, there were what came to be known as the first town hall meetings. These were really important meetings and early examples of direct democracy in colonial America. Only all church-going males could participate, and early on it was only land-owning males could participate, church-going, land-owning males. But nonetheless, this was the first type of example of a direct democracy where people were making the laws, their own laws, and living in society through those laws. So you have two places now in North America, right, where we have examples of representative and direct democracy. We got the Virginia House of Burgesses, and of course then we have the town hall meetings that were taking place in New England. And what was different about New England, economically speaking, we'll talk about this later too in another slide, is that their economy tended to be more mixed. There was a little more diversity with the products that were being made and the agricultural products that were being made. But also the New England colonies would eventually be known for their manufacturing and shipping and fishing, obviously since they were next to the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so the last few slides here are just kind of in a nutshell what the different colonies were like, specifically New England. So these are really helpful slides for you to review if you need just to remember some quick characteristics about each region. Chapter 2 primarily deals with the Chesapeake region and the New England region. So take a look. The New England economy here was based largely on small subsistence farmers, okay? Shipbuilders, fur traders, fishing, whaling, merchants, those kinds of things. Most families lived on small farms, okay, as opposed to the larger plantations that would take shape in the Chesapeake colonies, right? And because of the environment and because of the geography, those led to, of course, they had access to large, abundant forests, which means that they were huge, big into timber, like I said, fur trading, lumber, those kinds of industries besides farming. Okay, they had ports, the port of Boston, right? Boston was founded eventually by the people who settled along the northeastern coast. And then, like I said, fur traders, shipbuilding, and merchants became part of the economy as well. So here's a typical scene for maybe a New England colony. This is, if you had to go back in a time machine to 1630, 1640, you would see something like this, perhaps. In New England, you had a more diversified economy than you found in the Chesapeake. And then, like I said, the New England colonies, one of the key features there was the idea of direct democracy. But it wasn't just direct democracy. Direct democracy can be shown through the document, the Mayflower Compact, right? There was another document that was drawn up too, known as the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, when the colony of Connecticut was founded. The reason these two are important is that if you look at these very carefully, you notice that the word God is used in both documents quite often. Looking at the Mayflower Compact, the phrase, the glory of God and advancement of Christian faith, solemnly and mutually in the presence of God, right? The word covenant is used. Same with the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. That was a very important document as well. Gathered together the word of God, established according to God, right? So the reason I'm showing you this is that these are two key primary sources, and these are two examples of not just direct democracy, but also a kind of government known as a theocracy. Really what the New England government was a theocracy, where religious leaders, church leaders, were also the same people who made government and political decisions for the colony, right? We don't have that today. And there were many people back then that were against this kind of government, a theocracy. There, Roger Williams, for example, who was kicked out of the Puritan colony, out of Massachusetts Bay Colony, who later went on to found the colony of Rhode Island, was a strong believer that religion and government should be separated, like we have today. The two are not intermixed. We don't have religious leaders making government decisions for us. But back then, the Puritans, you could argue, was very much, their colonies were very much a theocracy. Like I said, there were people that did challenge the Puritan way of life, and the Puritans would have nothing of it. One was Thomas Hooker. He promoted religious tolerance. In other words, he would be one of the first guys who said this shouldn't be just for Puritans. In other words, he disagreed largely with the Puritan laws. He was essentially banished from the colony, and he went on to found the colony of Connecticut. And that's how the fundamental orders of Connecticut were drawn up. Roger Williams, I mentioned his name before. He was a huge believer in this idea of separation of church and state, more religious toleration. He also was kicked out. You can see in the far left here, down in the lower left. He was exiled from Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he went on to found the colony of Rhode Island. And then probably the most famous was Anne Hutchinson. She was a strong, independent female voice within Massachusetts Bay Colony. She was also banned from the colony because she complained too much against the Puritan Church. She was eventually exiled, and she eventually moved to Rhode Island once Rhode Island was founded by Roger Williams to practice her religious freedom. So you did have voices of dissent against the Puritans and their way of life. In fact, it got so extreme that by the 1690s, because of the emphasis placed on Puritanism and religion and whatnot, eventually a series of trials took place, known as the Salem witch trials. And Puritans strongly believed that witchcraft was being used, and demons were possessing many of the people in the colony, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and paranoia started to ensue. And that kind of spread from Europe to North America. So when it arrived here in North America, the Puritan leaders really felt strongly that their religious roots and their colony was being punished by presence of witches and witchcraft. And of course, historians have largely said, well, that just simply wasn't the case. But that's not what they believed in 1692. So they put more than 100 people on trial. Many of them were young women, and 20 of them were actually put to death. And you can see here a rendition of the Salem witch trials that took place, accused witches that were tried and eventually convicted. And also this one here, they were hanged in public as punishment. There were some serious questions after the series of these trials that were raised about the power of the church, about how what role religious law should play, and really how fair were these trials, because many of these people, of course, were innocent people that had nothing to do with any kind of witches or demons or witchcraft. Okay, so the Salem witch trials, I believe, is talked about in your textbook as well. And like I said, the New England colonies were largely considered a theocracy, in other words, religious government. Government leaders were the church members. Ministers had the authority as head of the colony. They had the same power as the colonial leaders. And basically then what we're saying is that church law that governed the church was also the laws that governed the colony. And because of this, there was a direct relationship, but also government affected religion. So if you have religious leaders that are also our government leaders started to outlaw certain religions because they had the authority to do so. They had the power to punish dissenters against the Puritan colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And therefore government started to enforce certain worship styles, what could or could not be worshipped, when people could worship, and just basically instruct people what was right or wrong. And that's why people like Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams had such a problem with this theocratic type of government. So the idea of separation of church and state existed, right? Now we're talking Roger Williams, especially, and Anne Hutchinson, where government and religion should be separated. Government leaders would be allowed to be religious, but the laws would not be religious. right? And that's what is practiced here in America and many countries around the world, where our government leaders are not our religious leaders. And religious law, church law, does not dictate political law or the laws that we live by on a day-to-day basis. There would be laws made that would ensure religious freedom, but there wouldn't be laws like you saw above here that would give the power, let's say, to the governor of a colony to punish someone because they weren't worshiping correctly. Okay? And what started to come about is that the population, as it started to increase, they started to elect representatives to government to make decisions for them. And it was the jobs of those representatives to make laws. In other words, those moral codes. Just like today, we elect representatives to Congress or to city council. It doesn't matter. We believe we entrust our vote to them, right, to make the laws on behalf of us. Okay, and then finally finishing off here, Chapter 2 ends. I told you earlier that there was an ongoing conflict between American Indians and, of course, especially the English settlers early on in the 17th century. There were a series of three major, actually two major wars that took place. I already told you about the Powhatan Wars that took place between roughly 1615 and 1645. That was, remember, in Virginia, the Chesapeake colonies. While that was going on, you also had a series of wars known as the Pequot Wars that were going on in New England, off and on for the better part of the decade of the 1630s and part of the 1640s. All in all, the New England colonists were able to wipe out the Pequot tribe in New England. And by 1643, the new King of England, King James, decided to take the Massachusetts and Plymouth colony and basically combine it into one larger colony known as the New England Confederation. And this was basically done as a military alliance. The idea was if these colonies were bigger, there would be strength in numbers, and it was intended to defend off any potential American Indian threats to the New England colonists. The New England Confederation would not last very long, but in 1643, roughly, the two colonies did form what was known as the New England Confederation for military purposes. And then finally, by the 1670s, you had another major conflict with the American Indian groups, if you're the English, and that was known as King Philip's War. The settlers knew him as King Philip, and you see a picture of him here on the slide. Within his tribe, he was known as Metacom, and he was the leader of the Wampanoags Indian tribe in New England. And eventually, he would be defeated as well by the colonists. And this war, King Philip's War, or Metacom's War, is significant because what this did is it basically signified the end of any type of major resistance between the New England settlers, the colonists there, and American Indian groups. Okay, so that kind of put a stamp on what would basically be 60, 70 years of conflict. So there are some parallels that are going on here, right? We've got similar forms of government in the Middle Colony, or the Chesapeake colonies in New England, representative government. We also have conflict with American Indians in both areas of what are becoming the 13 colonies, both in the Chesapeake and New England. So that essentially takes care of the notes for Chapter 2 here. These largely follow the text as you read through it. So, like I said, hopefully this will help you as you read through your text and you complete and work on your reading guide for Chapter 2. I will post these in the Period 2 folder, and I'll just simply label them. I'll label them something like Mr. Ristau's Chapter 2 lecture notes, okay, or video lecture notes. All right, guys, keep working ahead and make some headway with the notes and whatnot, and we'll see you if you're Period 2 in class on Monday, and if you're in Period 6, we will see you, of course, on Tuesday, the B day. Bye for now.